It's October 8th, and I was just talking about being tortured while having a psychological evaluation. Mainly, the torture that was used while I was talking to Lucretia was lower level, where I didn't notice it until I was halfway through the talking to her and I got up and left. But then what was done to me while I was taking the test was very obvious. It was noticeable as soon as I was sitting down. And when I left, as I say, there was a man driving by in some kind of a delivery truck. It was a white delivery truck, and he had brown hair. And I remember him because I wondered why. It was a very remote street and location that this psychological center was on. And I remember thinking, why would somebody come down this road specifically just to harass me when I'm walking out to get coffee? And I actually believe I saw that guy in the delivery van. It was in between talking to Lucretia and then taking the tests. So I saw him harassing me as I went across the street, and I faxed something over because I wanted to have the IQ portion done. And I was everything done all at once. And I had already contested and protested against having an IQ test done because I knew it was just going to be, it didn't matter how it turned out, it was going to be used against me, and it was an invasion of privacy. It didn't have anything to do with CPS. And at this point, basically every single place that I had been tortured, aside from a few instances where I was in a public location or maybe on a public bus and a couple of things were done, or I was with one person in particular and they maybe did something to me, with something that they were carrying on the bus and sitting behind me, aside from that kind of thing, basically all of the incidents of torture were occurring in hospital. They were all occurring in federally funded facilities. It was occurring in the incidences of torture, aside from targeting my entire house and my son and I at the house. Aside from our location, and aside from a few instances where, as I say, I was on the bus and maybe somebody's sitting behind me and I noticed something's going on the entire time. And that didn't happen until I was in Tennessee in 2010. So it was much later. Every single incident of torture, if it was not done at my private residence, it was being done at hospitals, at federal detention centers in the United States, for example, in Knoxville, Tennessee. It happened in Canada at the Canadian jail, in Penticton, BC. It happened at a Canadian RCMP, some kind of Canadian official's house, with him noticing, and he was connected to the government. It happened at the Immigration Hearing Center in Vancouver, Washington, not the main holding facility where all the plexiglass is and everything, but where more of the police are, the Canadian police, before people are meeting their attorneys before they go to an immigration hearing. It happened there. When I say hospitals, it's happened at multiple hospitals. It happened at in Wenatchee, Washington at Central Washington Hospital. It happened at Wenatchee Valley Medical Center. And then it happened in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt Emergency Room. I was tortured. I mean, basically like a burning sensation torture. It wasn't the same lower back torture that happened at Lucretia Krebs' offices. At those counseling offices, the Western Psychological receives federal funding. It's a federally run group. I was tortured there. I was tortured at Alvaro Pardo's house in Maryland, Germantown, Maryland. He works for the government. I was tortured at my residence in Arlington, Virginia, right across from the Pentagon. And I was tortured in my attorney's offices the first time that I sat down and met Justin Titus at the Catholic Irish law firm in Wenatchee, Washington. I was tortured. That wasn't exactly federally funded, but it had, I would group it with being connected to the state because he was my public defender. And a woman there, the main secretary, told me her child was part of the Department of Defense. I was tortured at, there is a Christian resource place, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's the main one in Wenatchee, and I got a lot of different assistants there. And then towards the end, they really hated me for some reason, and I was sitting there meeting with the pastor and with this other woman who was connected to a police because her daughter is married to a police officer in Wenatchee. And I was tortured while sitting with them in that room on that specific day, one time. And I remember being really shocked by it because they're supposed to be Protestant Christians. And they seemed to know that I was being tortured at the time that I was tortured. And because there was a different kind of an interest in watching me, so I thought that that was really strange. I have been tortured in the truck of a U.S. Army person who picked me up from New Mexico after I just talked to the FBI of New Mexico, who probably called Seattle FBI. I was tortured 3 blocks away from the Seattle FBI's offices. And I was tortured in the houses of people who work for the CIA and for the military. Almost every single instance of torture has been when I have been in a federally funded building, living with, and a couple of times, for example, with Steve Mays and with Theo Keys, I was tortured at both of those residents, and they're CIA and military connected, and I was tortured there at those houses. So in almost every situation, it's been torture when I'm around police, law enforcement, all the way from local law enforcement to FBI, to military police. And it's predominantly been in those kinds of areas. The only time that I have ever been tortured outside of a federally funded area, or when I'm not around, I mean, even when I was tortured when I was 7 months pregnant with my son, there was a Wenatchee police officer there and a U.S. Army man there at that barbecue. So there have always been federal persons and personnel present when I have been in the middle of being tortured. Except for the times, when I've been at my house with my son, nobody was in our house watching at that time. But so aside from full-blown torture at our permanent residences, it's been while in public, like federally funded public facilities, or next to those who are working for the federal government. The only times that I have not, it hasn't been in that kind of situation. One time it was at a hostel in Seattle. There was one thing that happened at a hostel. And, but anybody can go into a hostel. You could be a federal person or not. One time something happened when I was having lunch with a African-American man at a Mexican place. Several times in Nashville, Tennessee, while I was on the bus, something was happening, but prior to 2010, nobody ever did anything to me while I was on any kind of a bus. I never had anybody randomly, try to get on the same bus, or I was never tortured ever on a public bus of any kind. And so that did not happen until now. I was in Nashville, Tennessee in 2010 to 2011. I was tortured, I guess, in the workplace, only beginning in Nashville, Tennessee. And in both cases where I was tortured, the owners were military connected, military and CIA connected. Logan's Roadhouse is connected to the CIA and to the military, and I was hired by a military man. And I was used as research the entire time that I was there, and I was tortured almost every single day that I worked there. And that was at Logan's Roadhouse in Nashville, Tennessee. The other place that I worked at, this deli place, Mike's Deli, the boss who hired me was another federal worker. He was FEMA, F-E-M-A, Federal Emergency Management Agency or something. And I was tortured. I was only tortured on the last day that I worked there, and then he fired me. He basically, it was like I got tortured and then fired the same day. And when I say torture, I mean military means of using some kind of military energy and technology that caused excruciating pain, whether it was a kind of ultrasound that was directed towards my lower back that caused heating slowly, and it was unnoticeable at first, and then it got worse and worse and caused great weakness in the lower back and aching. Whether it was that, whether it was getting little electrical zaps, whether it was being what felt like being fried, regardless of the form of torture, everything that was being done to me was being done to me by people who were connected to the federal government.